Hello everyone! I am here at Olympic National Park, one of my most favorite places, to show you around the intertidal habitat. Now if we think about what that word means, inter means between. So for example, when we think about an interstate highway, that's a highway that goes between several states. And then tidal refers to, of course, the tides. So intertidal means between the tides. So right now I'm standing up by a really cool sea arch, and I'm in the high intertidal zone. So let me show you what that means. Now I'm still standing in the same location, but I've flipped the camera so you can see that right now it is approaching low tide. Low tide is occurring in about 45 minutes, and so the waves are, when the water is way out there. I am right now in the high intertidal zone. So I've walked back up here to where I found the rack lines from last night's high tide. So these lines here are called rack lines, and this is the stuff that has washed in with the last high tide. And if I get down closer to one of these rack lines, you can see that what gets carried in is a lot of woody debris. There are some needles from some conifers. There are usually some lightweight shells. And then of course, because of the day and age that we live in, there are some feathers and unfortunately lots of plastic, which is very lightweight. Here's another blue fragment. And then here I see what is called a nurdle. Nurdles are small plastic pellets. These are pre-production pellets. So these small pellets are shipped all around the world, and they are melted down and used to make lots and lots of different types of consumer goods. And so unfortunately, these nurdles get lost from trucks, trains, ships during every stage of their journey, and that's why we can find them on our beaches, sometimes in pretty high numbers. So one of the things I'll do before I leave today is, after I enjoy the organisms in the low tide, I'll actually come up here with a bag and pick up a bunch of this plastic. But back to the intertidal. So now I'm up here where the last high tide was, and you can see where the low tide currently is. And right now we're in spring tides, which means the high tides come up really high and the low tides go out really low. And so the area in between is the intertidal habitat. I've chosen this beach in particular because it has these really nice vertical tall rock formations. So in a place like this, seeing vertical zonation is really obvious. If you're on a beach that has much more of a gradual slope to it, the vertical zonation is still there. It's just not as easy to see, certainly not in one photo or one video shot. So if we look up at the very top of this rock formation, we can see that there's really nothing living up there. It's just bare solid rock. At least no marine organisms living up there. But then right when you get to around this level, you can start to see some organisms living there. So this is the high intertidal. And then notice that's kind of like a stripe. And then right here, there is a second layer that looks very different from this top layer. So this is more of the mid intertidal, and the creatures that live there are different. And then down here, kind of there's one last stripe. This is the low intertidal. And as I mentioned before, the organisms that live in each zone are very different based on their ability to tolerate air exposure versus seawater exposure. So let's get a little bit closer and I'll show you what's living in each of these zones. Okay, I've climbed up on this rock. So let's take a look at what we can see up here. One of the first things I would like to point out is the fact that up here in the very high intertidal, the density of organisms is not as great as it is in the mid and the low intertidal, meaning that the organisms are pretty spread out and there's plenty of space for all the organisms that are living here. So what we have here are some limpets, some small barnacles. We've got a little bit of seaweed here. You can see more of the seaweed there. And there's really not much else up here. Okay, now let's make that transition from high intertidal to mid intertidal, and you'll notice that the change is pretty abrupt. You start to see a lot of different types of organisms, and one of the other things you can notice is that, I mean, look at how little bare rock there is. Here's just a little bit right here, but almost every square centimeter is covered with organisms. So space is definitely a limiting factor in the intertidal. Now what we have here are some barnacles still, but many different species. These barnacles are quite a bit larger than those smaller ones that we saw up in the high intertidal, which we can find here as well. We also see mussels, and there are several snails. There are a couple different types of seaweed, but there's still not much seaweed in this zone. What else do we have? Oh, here's another type of barnacle, and then you can see more of the mussels. Lastly, we'll take a look at the organisms of the low intertidal. Here you can see lots of barnacles, some of the same ones that we saw in the mid intertidal, but mixed among this group of barnacles, there are these leathery tubes. These are the tubes of a feather duster worm, and we unfortunately can't see the worm's tentacles right now because the tide is low, and the tentacles will only come out during high tide when the organism is submerged so that it can feed. Just above those, here are some aggregating or pink-tipped anemones. And then over here is another type of anemone. Those are the giant green anemones. They are very common in the low intertidal at this park. This pink stuff down here is a type of coralline algae. There are actually a couple different types here. And then next to that is some more fleshy seaweed. And what else do we have here? Here is a nice big limpet. There's another one hiding there under the seaweed with a barnacle actually attached to it. Oh, back here, there's a chitin. And then of course we have some beautiful ochre sea stars. And here's a type of kelp as well. So those are some of the organisms that are most commonly found in the low intertidal. And again, because these organisms can't tolerate being out of seawater for too long, we tend to only find most of these organisms in the low intertidal. Okay, that is your tour of the intertidal in Olympic National Park. As you might be able to tell, some of these giant green anemones here are starting to re-emerge. They're starting to extend their tentacles because the tide has turned and it's on its way back in. The sun is fully shining and I am going to head out. But on my way, as I always do, I brought a little bag with me and I'm gonna walk that high tide line back to the trail and pick up some of those pieces of plastic.